My grandson Jamie brought me a tart, its delicate crust glistening with fresh berries. I love you, Grandma, he said with a shy smile that masked an unsettling tension. But before I could savor the sweetness, a wave of nausea hit me like a freight train. Something was terribly wrong. Before I share what happened next, comment below with your thoughts, and follow if you believe that love can sometimes hide dark secrets. The afternoon sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of Grandma Evelyn's living room, casting delicate patterns on the worn wooden floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one by the window where the light was just right for her knitting. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the occasional chirp of birds outside. It was the kind of peaceful moment Evelyn treasured after a lifetime of bustling family gatherings and noisy holiday dinners. At 78 years old, she had learned to savor these calm pockets of time before the world demanded her attention again. Her thoughts drifted to her grandson, Jamie, who was due to visit that afternoon. He had been a bright, cheerful boy before the terrible loss of his mother, Evelyn's daughter, 6 months earlier. Since then, Jamie had become quieter, more withdrawn, and Evelyn had worried deeply about how he was coping with the grief. She had resolved to be extra patient and gentle with him, hoping to provide some comfort in the wake of their shared sorrow. Just as she was about to set down her knitting and make a cup of tea, the front door creaked open. Jamie appeared in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the fading light. Evelyn's face lit up with a warm smile that crept into her eyes, softening the lines of age and worry. "There you are, sweetheart," she said, rising slowly to greet him. Jamie shuffled inside, holding something behind his back. "Grandma," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made this for you." He stepped forward and revealed a small tart, its golden crust dusted lightly with powdered sugar and dotted with fresh berries that gleamed like jewels. It was homemade, obviously, and the effort was clear in the careful lattice work across the top. Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion as she took the tart from him. "Oh, Jamie, this is wonderful. Thank you." She reached out to hug him, feeling the faint tremble in his arms as he returned the embrace. For a moment, the weight of recent months seemed to lift, replaced by the simple sweetness of a grandson's love. They sat together at the kitchen table, the tart placed in the center like a treasure. Evelyn sliced a piece, savoring the smell of warm berries and buttery crust. Jamie watched her with a shy smile, as if pleased by her delight. "I love you, Grandma," he said softly, a phrase that felt both fragile and powerful in the quiet room. But as Evelyn took her first bite, a sudden wave of nausea swept over her. The tart's sweetness turned sour in her mouth, and a sharp pain bloomed in her stomach. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. Jamie's eyes widened in alarm. "Grandma? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Within minutes, Evelyn's condition worsened. She felt dizzy and disoriented, the room spinning around her like a carousel gone awry. Jamie fumbled for the phone, his small fingers trembling as he dialed emergency services. "Please come quickly," he urged the operator, his voice breaking. The ambulance arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. Paramedics worked swiftly, checking Evelyn's vitals and securing her on a stretcher. Jamie was whisked along with her, clutching her hand tightly, his face pale and stricken with fear. At the hospital, doctors ran a battery of tests. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the harsh fluorescent lights did little to calm Evelyn's growing anxiety. She was hooked up to machines that beeped steadily, monitoring her fragile heartbeat. Hours passed like a heavy fog, the steady hum of hospital life pressing down upon her. When the toxicology report came back, it shattered the fragile hope that this was a simple illness. The tart she had eaten was laced with poison. The realization hit her like a cold slap. Someone had tried to kill her, and the source of the threat was terrifyingly close. Jamie sat by her bedside, his young face etched with confusion and pain. How could the boy who had just told her he loved her be connected to this? The doctors assured Evelyn that the dose had been small enough to avoid fatal damage, but the danger was real, and the questions even more so. The incident thrust Evelyn into a bewildering and frightening new reality. The warmth of that afternoon, the love in Jamie's eyes, now seemed tainted by suspicion and fear. Was it possible that her own grandson had been involved in this act? Or had someone else manipulated him in some dark way? As Evelyn lay in the hospital bed, her mind raced to piece together what had happened. The tart, the words, the sudden illness, it all felt like a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. She knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Her relationship with Jamie, once a source of comfort and hope, was now shadowed by doubt. Yet beneath the shock and confusion, a stubborn ember of love remained. Evelyn resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. For the sake of the boy she adored, and for her own survival, she had to understand what had led to that poisoned tart, and why it had come from the hands of the child she trusted most. To truly grasp how the afternoon had twisted from warmth to terror, I needed to rewind the clock 6 months, back to the days when Jamie was still the bright-eyed boy I'd always known. After the sudden loss of his mother, my daughter, Anna, our family had been shattered. The grief settled like a heavy fog over us all, but it was Jamie who bore the brunt of it in ways I couldn't fully understand. He was only 9, but the sadness in his eyes made him seem years older. At first, Jamie clung to me, seeking refuge in the one stable presence left in his life. I did my best to be that refuge, opening my home and heart to him without hesitation. We would sit for hours after school, working on puzzles or reading stories, trying to patch the gaping hole Anna's death had left. I watched for signs of healing, hoping to see the light return to his face, that spark that meant he was beginning to move forward. But as the weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle changes. Jamie became quieter, less engaged with the world around him. He stopped asking questions about school or friends and retreated into himself. Sometimes, I caught him staring blankly out the window, his small hands clenched tightly in his lap. The laughter that used to bubble up so naturally was replaced by a silence that felt ominous. There were moments when I wondered if he was angry at the world, at himself, or maybe even at me for not being able to bring his mother back. He refused to talk about Anna, and when I gently tried to ask, he would shake his head and retreat to his room. It tore at me, this wall growing between us, but I told myself to be patient. Grief wasn't a race, after all. Then there was the matter of his caretaker, Mrs. Langley. After Anna's death, Jamie's father had to travel frequently for work and arranged for Mrs. Langley to help with Jamie during the week. She was a woman in her 60s, with a stern demeanor and an air that never quite sat right with me. I had met her only a handful of times, and each encounter left me feeling uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Jamie seemed reluctant to talk about Mrs. Langley, and whenever I asked, he gave me vague answers. "She's just helping," he'd say, but the hesitation in his voice told me there was more beneath the surface. I started to notice changes in Jamie's behavior after she was around. He became withdrawn even more, and once I overheard him whispering to himself in a way that made my heart ache. The strain on our small family was palpable. My son-in-law, Jamie's father, was distant and overwhelmed, unable to provide the emotional support Jamie needed. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me, trying to fill the gaps left by Anna's absence and the fractured family dynamics. Despite all this, I held on to hope. I believed that with love and support, Jamie would find his way back to the light. I thought that perhaps the worst was behind us and that the silence he wrapped around himself was just a phase we could outlast. I spent hours planning activities, trying to coax him out of his shell, baking, reading, even gardening, which Anna had loved. I wanted to recreate a sense of normalcy, a safe place where Jamie could heal. One evening, I sat with him at the kitchen table, watching as he carefully traced shapes in the condensation on his glass of water. "Jamie," I said softly, "I know things have been hard. But I'm here for you, always." He looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears, and nodded once, barely audible. That was the closest I'd come to breaking through his wall. But beneath the surface, there were signs I couldn't ignore. Jamie's school reports showed a decline in his grades and participation. His teacher mentioned he seemed distracted and sometimes withdrawn during lessons. I tried to meet with them, but the conversations left me feeling more helpless than hopeful. There were whispers about Jamie acting out at times, though nothing concrete. I knew Jamie was hurting, but I was beginning to realize that the pain he carried was more tangled and complex than grief alone. The quiet boy who once sought comfort from his grandmother was becoming a mystery I didn't know how to solve. Looking back, I can see now that the thread started to unravel around the time Mrs. Langley entered our lives more permanently. Jamie's secretive behavior grew, furtive glances, hushed phone calls when he thought no one was listening, and a reluctance to share even the smallest details of his days. It was as if he was protecting himself from something I couldn't yet understand. I tried to talk to him gently, to open the door for communication without forcing it, but he clammed up even more. One afternoon, I found a note tucked under his pillow, written in his shaky handwriting, "I'm scared." My heart broke in two. Scared of what? I didn't know. Scared of whom? The question swirled in my mind, but Jamie wouldn't say. The more I pondered, the more I questioned the people around him. Who was really looking after Jamie when I wasn't there? Was Mrs. Langley someone I could trust? I had to believe so, or at least, I wanted to. But the nagging feeling of unease persisted, growing heavier with each passing day. In the meantime, I clung to the memories of Anna's laughter, the way Jamie's face would light up when he talked about his mother, and the fragile hope that, somehow, we could navigate through this darkness together. I read books on childhood trauma and grief, consulted counselors, and reached out to support groups, desperate for answers and guidance. Yet, despite all my efforts, Jamie's world seemed to be closing in on him. The boy who once ran to me with open arms was now a shadow, retreating further from the warmth I tried to offer. I felt helpless, watching the boy I loved slip away into silence. And then came the afternoon when Jamie arrived with that tart, his small hands trembling as he presented it to me with the words, "I love you, Grandma." Those words, so simple yet so profound, had rekindled a flicker of hope in my heart. Maybe he was reaching out. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter. But that hope was cruelly shattered when, after tasting the tart, I was struck by sudden illness. The realization that the very boy I had been trying to protect was somehow entwined in this nightmare was a blow I wasn't prepared for. As I lay in the hospital bed, I thought back over those 6 months, the smiles and silences, the hope and the fear, and I knew that to protect Jamie and myself, I had to understand everything, the changes, the secrets, and the shadows lurking behind his quiet gaze. Only then could I begin to unravel the mystery that had turned our lives upside down. The moment Jamie handed me that tart, his shy smile and the words, "I love you, Grandma," had felt like a fragile thread of hope woven through months of fear and uncertainty. At first, I wanted to believe it was genuine, that beneath the silence and shadows, my grandson was reaching out, trying to reconnect. But as the nausea took hold and the hospital's sterile walls closed in around me, a gnawing doubt began to take root. Once I was stable enough to leave the hospital, I returned home determined to understand what had happened. The tart was the key, and Jamie's sudden affection, the tart's sweet gesture, began to feel like a carefully constructed facade. I knew I had to look closer, beneath the surface. In the days that followed, subtle clues began to emerge, setting my instincts on high alert. Jamie's behavior, which I had tried to interpret as grief and retreat, now seemed layered with something darker, something I couldn't quite place. He was still quiet, but his eyes darted nervously when I brought up the incident. His usual warmth was replaced by a guardedness that set my heart racing with worry. I started to notice odd things, Jamie avoiding certain topics altogether, changing the subject whenever I asked about the tart or the day he made it. Once, he even flinched when I mentioned Mrs. Langley, the caretaker I'd never fully trusted. There were furtive phone calls I caught him making in whispered tones, the kind of calls that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. One afternoon, I found Jamie sitting alone in the garden, his face pale and drawn. I sat beside him, my voice gentle. "Jamie, can you tell me what's going on? I want to help you." He looked up, eyes wide and scared, and for a moment, I thought he might speak. But instead, he shook his head and ran inside. That night, I lay awake, the house silent except for the ticking clock. My mind raced through memories and possibilities. Was Jamie acting of his own free will, or was someone manipulating him? Had the kindness I thought he felt for me been a mask, a trap? The questions churned relentlessly. driven by fear and confusion, I began to dig deeper. I spoke carefully with Jamie's school counselor, hoping for insight. She mentioned a few incidents. Jamie had been secretive, yes, but also occasionally withdrawn and jumpy, as if on edge. Nothing concrete, but enough to confirm my unease. I reached out to neighbors and family friends, quietly asking about Mrs. Langley. Their words were guarded, some hinting at her strict and sometimes harsh demeanor. One neighbor mentioned seeing Jamie looking upset after visits with her, but no one had confronted the caretaker directly. With every piece of information, my suspicion grew. I began to wonder if Jamie had been caught in a web of influence beyond his understanding. Was someone using his grief and vulnerability to their own ends? The thought was unbearable, but I had to face it. I started keeping a diary, noting every odd behavior, every evasive answer, every whispered phone call. I watched Jamie closely, trying to catch any slip or sign that would explain the poison-laced tart. Was he frightened? Was he being threatened? Or was he, somehow, complicit? One afternoon, I decided to confront Jamie gently. "Jamie, I know you didn't want to hurt me. If someone asked you to do something bad, you can tell me. I won't be angry." His eyes shimmered with tears, but he stayed silent. The weight of his silence was almost unbearable. Then, a breakthrough. While helping him with homework, I overheard Jamie whispering on the phone, his voice trembling, "I told you I can't. Grandma can't know." The words were vague but chilling. I realized there was someone controlling him, someone who had forced him into this nightmare. I resolved to protect Jamie, to unravel the mystery no matter the cost. I discreetly contacted a private investigator, hoping to uncover who might be manipulating my grandson. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Langley was involved, but I had no proof. Meanwhile, Jamie's behavior grew more erratic. He avoided eye contact, flinched at sudden noises, and sometimes woke in the night screaming. I stayed by his side, offering what comfort I could, knowing that the boy I loved was trapped in a dangerous, invisible cage. The days blurred into a tense waiting game. I kept the police informed about the poisoning but worried that without clear evidence, nothing would happen. I was caught between wanting to protect Jamie and needing to expose the truth. One evening, as I reviewed notes the investigator had sent me, my phone rang. It was Jamie, whispering hurriedly, "Grandma, I'm scared. Please don't let them hurt you." His voice cracked, and tears spilled down my cheeks. The boy I knew was still in there, frightened and desperate. I realized then that the tart was not just a poisoned pastry, it was a cry for help, a twisted message from someone who had ensnared Jamie in their dangerous game. My heart ached with a fierce determination to save him, to break the hold that fear and manipulation had over my grandson. I began to prepare for what lay ahead, knowing that uncovering the truth would be painful and fraught with danger. But I could no longer stand by, helpless. Jamie had trusted me once, and I needed to be the one to protect him now. With every cautious step, I steeled myself for the battles to come, determined to pierce the veil of secrecy that surrounded Jamie's life. The tart had been just the beginning, a harbinger of deeper shadows lurking beneath the surface of our fragile family. And I was ready to face them, whatever the cost. The pieces of the puzzle finally began to fall into place on a bleak afternoon when the private investigator I'd hired called with news that chilled me to the bone. Jamie wasn't acting alone, or even of his own volition. He had been manipulated, coerced by someone lurking in the shadows, someone who saw his grief and vulnerability as tools for a dark purpose. The revelation was as heartbreaking as it was terrifying. My sweet, silent grandson was a victim, ensnared in a web far beyond his years or understanding. The poison-laced tart had not been a deliberate act of malice on his part but a cruel command imposed by a sinister figure whose identity we had only just begun to uncover. With the help of the investigator and a trusted family friend who had long suspected something amiss, I confronted the harsh reality. The caretaker, Mrs. Langley, was not the nurturing presence I'd hoped for. Instead, she was the puppeteer pulling strings behind the scenes, her stern facade hiding a dangerous intent. The evidence revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation and threats aimed at Jamie, coercing him into acts that endangered us both. Summoning all my courage, I arranged a meeting with the authorities, armed with the findings from the investigation. The tension in the room was palpable as I recounted Jamie's behavioral changes, the whispered phone calls, and the chilling moment when he confessed his fear in a trembling voice. The police took the allegations seriously, launching a thorough inquiry into Mrs. Langley's background and her interactions with Jamie. Meanwhile, I worked closely with Jamie, providing the support and safety he so desperately needed. Slowly, he began to open up, his voice trembling but resolute as he recounted the fear that had gripped him, the threats, the isolation, the impossible demands. His confession was a heartbreaking glimpse into a child caught in a nightmare not of his making. The confrontation with Mrs. Langley was inevitable. One crisp morning, with law enforcement present, I faced her in the living room where so many quiet afternoons had passed. She feigned innocence, her lips tight and eyes cold, but beneath her calm exterior, I sensed the dangerous resolve that had ensnared Jamie. The showdown was tense but brief, the evidence overwhelming. The police moved swiftly to remove Mrs. Langley from our lives, placing her under investigation for child endangerment and coercion. Jamie was finally freed from her grasp, his small shoulders visibly lighter as the shadow of fear began to lift. But the ordeal was far from over. The emotional scars left on Jamie were deep, and I vowed to stand by him through the healing process. Therapy sessions began, providing a safe space for him to untangle the trauma and reclaim his childhood. The slow journey toward recovery was marked by small victories, a laugh here, a smile there, but also setbacks that tested our resolve. In the midst of this, I found strength in unexpected places. Family and friends rallied around us, offering support and understanding. Tyler, Jamie's father, who had been distant and overwhelmed, began to step up, confronting his own grief to be the father Jamie needed. Our fractured family started to mend, piece by fragile piece. The truth brought clarity but also sorrow. I reflected on the delicate balance of trust and protection within families, how easily that balance could be shattered by unseen forces. The betrayal was profound, but so was the resilience that followed. As the investigation unfolded, more unsettling details about Mrs. Langley came to light, her history of manipulation and control, similar patterns in previous caretaking roles, and a chilling disregard for the well-being of those she was supposed to protect. The full extent of her deception deepened my resolve to ensure justice was served. Throughout the legal proceedings, I stood by Jamie and Tyler, a pillar of strength amid the storm. The court hearings were grueling, exposing painful truths but ultimately affirming our fight for safety and healing. Mrs. Langley's conviction was a moment of justice, a safeguard against further harm. Yet, even as justice was served, I knew the path ahead was long. Trust once broken is not easily rebuilt, and the wounds left by fear and manipulation would take time to heal. But with each passing day, Jamie grew stronger, his spirit rekindled by love and support. In quiet moments, I watched him play in the garden, the boy I'd held in my arms months ago now beginning to reclaim his laughter. The memory of the poisoned tart remained a stark reminder of the darkness we'd faced, but it no longer defined us. Together, we faced the future, scarred, perhaps, but unbroken. The ordeal had tested our family in unimaginable ways, but it had also revealed the depths of our resilience and the unyielding power of love to heal and protect. The days that followed Mrs. Langley's arrest were filled with a cautious kind of hope. Jamie and I began the slow, delicate process of rebuilding what had been fractured, not just the bond between us, but the fragile trust that trauma had nearly shattered. Therapy sessions became a steady part of our routine. Each week, Jamie would sit quietly with his counselor, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, but always moving forward in his own time. I watched from the sidelines, heart-aching and hopeful, knowing that healing was neither linear nor swift. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been tension and unspoken fears, there was now space for laughter, even if tentative at first. Jamie's smiles returned in flickers, small victories that felt monumental. He began to talk more about school, about friends, and occasionally about his mother, Anna. Those moments were bittersweet, a reminder of loss but also of life's persistence. Tyler, Jamie's father, stepped into his role with newfound determination. I saw the man who had seemed so distant begin to engage more deeply, joining us for therapy sessions and family dinners. His grief was still raw, but he was learning to channel it into strength, for Jamie, for me, and for himself. Watching him grow into the father Jamie needed was a balm to my weary soul. We learned to navigate the complex landscape of trust and protection anew. Boundaries were redefined, and open communication became our safeguard. The experience had taught us that love alone was not always enough, vigilance and honesty were equally vital. We became a family not just by blood but through conscious effort to heal together. The legal battle against Mrs. Langley was arduous. Courtrooms filled with harsh truths and painful testimonies, but justice prevailed. Her conviction brought a measure of closure, a formal acknowledgement of the harm she had inflicted. Still, the shadow of her betrayal lingered, a reminder of how fragile safety can be. Yet amid the challenges, moments of grace emerged. One afternoon, as Jamie and I baked a simple berry pie together, no lattice crust this time, just a humble dessert, we shared a laugh over a flour mishap. The kitchen was filled with warmth and the scent of fresh fruit, a quiet reclamation of joy. Jamie looked up at me, eyes shining, and said, "Thank you, Grandma." Those words, so sincere and sweet, carried the weight of all we had endured. I reflected often on the intricate layers of love and protection within families, the way bonds can be tested, broken, and rebuilt. The experience had deepened my understanding of forgiveness, not only for others but for ourselves. We had stumbled, faltered, and yet here we were, moving forward. I also became more aware of the vigilance required to safeguard those we love. The world can be unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but with awareness and care, dangers can be confronted before they consume. I vowed to remain watchful, to trust my instincts, and to cherish the fragile beauty of trust when it is restored. Our story was far from perfect, marked by pain but also by resilience. Jamie's journey toward healing was ongoing, and so was mine. But as I sat beside him one quiet evening, watching the light fade gently outside the window, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the love that had endured, for the strength rediscovered, and for the promise of brighter days ahead. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges awaited us, the bond between grandmother and grandson was unbreakable. Together, we could face whatever storms life might bring, fortified by the hard-won lessons of our past and the hope we nurtured in the present. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.